Viking women, were they truly the powerful warriors depicted in modern series? Or were they women struggling to survive in a male-dominated society, constantly under threat? The truth is, nothing like what you might think. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The popular image of Viking women has been painted by Hollywood brushes and romantic notions of gender equality that simply didn't exist in the harsh realities of 9th and 10th century Scandinavia. While modern television shows portray fierce shield maidens fighting alongside men as equals, the archaeological and historical evidence tells a far different, far grimmer story. The truth about Viking women's lives reveals a world where survival was the primary concern, where every day brought new challenges that could mean the difference between life and death, and where the romantic notions of warrior women were overshadowed by the brutal realities of simply staying alive in one of history's most unforgiving society. To understand the true position of women in Viking society, one must first grasp the fundamental structure of Norse civilization itself. Viking society was built upon a rigid hierarchy that determined every aspect of daily life, from the food one ate, to the clothes one wore, from the house one lived in to the very words one was allowed to speak in public. At the top of this pyramid sat the Jarls, the noble class who owned vast territories and commanded the loyalty of hundreds of followers. Below them were the Carls, the free farmers and craftsmen who formed the backbone of Viking society, owning their own land and having the right to bear arms and participate in local assemblies called things. At the bottom of this social ladder were the thralls, the slaves who had no rights whatsoever and could be bought, sold, or killed at their master's whim. Within this hierarchical structure, women occupied a complex and often contradictory position. Unlike their counterparts in many other medieval societies, Viking women did possess certain legal rights that might seem progressive by the standards of their time. They could own property, request divorces under specific circumstances, and even run businesses in their husband's absence. However, these rights came with severe limitations and were always subject to the overriding authority of male family members. A woman's status was entirely dependent on her relationship to men. First her father, then her husband, and if widowed, her eldest son or male relative who would assume guardianship over her. The legal framework that governed women's lives was codified in various law codes that have survived from the Viking Age, including the Gragas from Iceland and various provincial laws from Norway and Denmark. These legal documents reveal a society that viewed women as valuable property rather than independent individuals. A woman's worth was literally calculated in terms of her bride price, the amount her family could expect to receive when she married, and her mourning gift, the property she would receive from her husband the day after their wedding night as compensation for her virginity. Marriage in Viking society was rarely about love or personal choice. Instead, it was a carefully calculated economic and political transaction designed to strengthen family alliances, consolidate land holdings, or forge new trade partnerships. Young girls, often as young as 12 or 13, found themselves betrothed to men they had never met, sometimes decades older than themselves, chosen entirely by their fathers based on what would benefit the family's economic and social standing. The concept of romantic love as a basis for marriage was not merely absent. It was actively discouraged as a dangerous emotion that could lead to poor decision-making and family discord. The wedding ceremony itself, while often portrayed in modern media as a celebration of love, was actually a formal transfer of ownership from father to husband. The bride had no say in the proceedings, no ability to object or refuse, and no legal recourse if she found her new husband abusive or incompatible. The marriage contract, negotiated entirely between the male heads of both families, specified not only the bride price and mourning gift, but also detailed arrangements about property rights, inheritance, and even the circumstances under which divorce might be permitted. Once married, a Viking woman found herself bound by a complex web of expectations and restrictions that governed every aspect of her existence. She was expected to be fertile and produce healthy children, particularly sons who could carry on the family name and inherit property. She was required to manage the household efficiently, ensuring that food was prepared, clothes were made and mended, and that the domestic sphere ran smoothly enough to support her husband's public and economic activities. She was obligated to be hospitable to guests, maintaining the family's reputation for generosity and proper behavior according to the complex social codes that governed Viking society. The household that a Viking woman was expected to manage was far more complex and demanding than modern people might imagine. A typical farming household might include not only the immediate family but also elderly relatives, unmarried siblings, hired workers, and several slaves. During busy seasons like harvest time or when preparing for long trading voyages, the household might swell to include dozens of people, all of whom needed to be fed, housed, and organized efficiently. The mistress of such a household bore ultimate responsibility for ensuring that everyone was clothed, fed, and assigned appropriate tasks according to their status and abilities. Property rights for women, while more extensive than in many contemporary societies, were still severely limited and always subject to male oversight. A woman could inherit property from her father if she had no brothers, but this inheritance was typically held in trust by her husband or male guardian, who made all decisions about its use and disposition. She could own personal property such as jewelry, clothes, and household items, but significant assets like land, livestock, or trade goods remained under male control. Even the property she brought to a marriage as her dowry, while technically remaining hers, was managed entirely by her husband, who could use the income from it as he saw fit. The legal right to divorce, often cited as evidence of women's relative freedom in Viking society, was in practice extremely difficult to exercise and came with severe social and economic consequences. A woman could petition for divorce on grounds of physical abuse, impotence, or her husband's failure to provide adequate support. But she needed to prove her case before a thing, an assembly composed entirely of men who might be more sympathetic to her husband's position than to hers. Even if granted a divorce, a woman faced immediate economic hardship, as she would typically only be entitled to reclaim her original dowry, leaving her without means of support unless her family was willing and able to take her back. The social expectations placed upon Viking women extended far beyond the domestic sphere into complex networks of obligation and reciprocity that bound families and communities together. A woman was expected to maintain relationships with other women in the community, participating in collective activities like textile production, food preservation, and child rearing. She was required to show proper respect and deference to women of higher social status, while maintaining her own family's dignity and reputation. She was obligated to participate in religious ceremonies and seasonal festivals, often playing specific roles in the elaborate rituals that marked important transitions in the agricultural and social calendar. Religious life presented both opportunities and additional burdens for Viking women. While they could serve as priestesses in certain cults, particularly those associated with fertility and domestic prosperity, they were excluded from the warrior cults that dominated Viking religious practice. The goddess Freya, often cited as evidence of powerful feminine divinity in Norse religion, was primarily worshipped in her aspects as a fertility goddess and protector of the household, roles that reinforced rather than challenged traditional gender expectation. Women were expected to maintain household shrines, perform daily offerings, and ensure that proper rituals were observed to protect their families from supernatural threats. The economic contributions of Viking women, while essential to family survival and prosperity, were largely invisible in the historical record because they were considered part of natural domestic duty rather than noteworthy achievements. Women were responsible for managing family finances on a day-to-day basis, making decisions about food purchases, allocating resources for household needs, and often supervising the work of slaves and servants. They participated in local markets, trading surplus household products like butter, cheese, and textiles for goods the family needed. However, major economic decisions about land purchases, trading ventures, or significant investments remained firmly in male hands. The intersection of social class and gender created even more complex dynamics within Viking society. A woman from a wealthy Jarl family enjoyed privileges and protections that were completely unavailable to a Carl's wife or a thrall woman. But even the highest-born woman remained subject to male authority and could find her status dramatically altered by changes in her family's fortunes or her husband's political standing. A wealthy woman might own slaves and manage extensive household operations, but she could not participate directly in the political assemblies where major decisions affecting her family and community were made. Education and intellectual development for women were limited and focused primarily on skills deemed necessary for their domestic roles. While some women learned to read runes for religious and practical purposes, formal education in law, poetry, or political affairs was generally reserved for men. Women's knowledge was primarily oral and practical, passed down through generations of mothers and daughters, encompassing everything from herbal medicine and food preparation to complex textile techniques and household management strategies. The reality of women's legal status becomes even more complex when examining the differences between theory and practice in Viking society. While laws granted certain rights to women, the actual exercise of these rights depended heavily on individual circumstances, family support, and social connections. A woman from a powerful family with many male relatives might find her theoretical rights well protected and respected, while a woman from a weaker family, or one that had fallen out of favor, might find herself unable to claim even basic legal protection. As we delve deeper into the daily realities of Viking women's lives, it becomes clear that the popular image of powerful, independent warrior women represents a tiny minority of exceptional individuals whose stories have been magnified and romanticized by modern media. The vast majority of Viking women lived lives of quiet desperation, bound by legal, social, and economic constraints that left them vulnerable to abuse, exploitation, and early death. Their stories, largely unrecorded by contemporary chroniclers who were primarily concerned with the deeds of men, can only be pieced together through archaeological evidence, legal documents, and the occasional glimpse provided by sagas that were written centuries after the fact. The foundation laid by understanding women's position in Viking social hierarchy reveals a society where gender roles were rigidly defined and ruthlessly enforced, where deviation from expected behavior could result in social ostracism, economic ruin, or even death. This context is essential for understanding the true nature of Viking women's daily struggles, the dangers they faced, and the remarkable resilience they displayed in simply surviving in one of history's most challenging environments. The romanticized notion of Viking domestic life, with its cozy hearths and bustling households filled with laughter and abundance, crumbles when confronted with the harsh realities of daily survival in medieval Scandinavia. For Viking women, each day began before dawn and ended long after sunset, filled with back-breaking labor, constant worry about family survival, and the ever-present threat that a single mistake in household management could mean starvation, illness, or death for everyone under their care. The physical demands of running a Viking household were staggering by modern standards. There were no labor-saving devices, no electricity, no running water, and no convenient stores where supplies could be purchased when needed. Everything required for family survival had to be produced, processed, preserved, or obtained through the woman's own efforts and careful management of limited resources. The mistress of a household was simultaneously a farmer, cook, textile worker, pharmacist, veterinarian, teacher, manager, and quartermaster. Roles that required not only physical strength and endurance, but also extensive knowledge passed down through generations of women who had learned these skills through necessity rather than choice. The day began while darkness still covered the landscape, usually around 4 or 5 in the morning during summer months, and even earlier during the endless nights of winter. The first task was always rekindling the fire, a process that could take precious time and energy if the embers had died during the night. Without fire, there was no warmth, no cooked food, no light for working, and no way to heat water for cleaning or cooking. The responsibility for maintaining the household fire fell entirely to women, and allowing it to die completely was considered a serious failure that could endanger the entire family's survival. Once the fire was restored and burning steadily, the next priority was checking on the livestock that formed the backbone of Viking economic life. Cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens required constant attention, and their health directly determined the family's ability to survive harsh winters and unexpected hardships. Women were responsible for milking cows and goats, collecting eggs, feeding animals, and monitoring their health for signs of disease that could devastate a family's wealth overnight. During calving season or when animals were sick, women might spend entire nights in cold, drafty barns assisting with difficult births or nursing sick animals back to health. The production of dairy products consumed enormous amounts of time and energy, but was essential for family nutrition and economic stability. Milk had to be processed immediately to prevent spoilage, requiring women to churn butter, make cheese, and prepare various fermented dairy products that could be stored for winter consumption. The churning process alone could take hours of repetitive, exhausting work, made more difficult by the need to maintain proper temperatures and cleanliness standards that would prevent the milk from spoiling before it could be processed. Textile production represented perhaps the most time-consuming and skilled aspect of women's work, requiring mastery of complex processes that took years to learn and decades to perfect. Every piece of cloth used by the family had to be produced from raw materials through a series of labor-intensive steps that occupied much of a woman's time throughout the year. The process began with shearing sheep, a task that required careful timing to ensure the wool was of good quality, followed by cleaning, carding, and spinning the raw wool into usable thread. The spinning process itself was a constant occupation for Viking women, who carried spindles with them throughout the day, spinning thread while walking, talking, or supervising other household activities. The amount of thread required for a single garment was enormous. A typical woolen dress might require thread spun from the fleece of several sheep, representing hundreds of hours of work before the actual weaving could even begin. Women became so accustomed to spinning that their hands would automatically reach for their spindles during any moment of inactivity, making thread production a continuous background activity that accompanied nearly every other task. Weaving the spun thread into usable cloth required additional specialized equipment and skills that were passed down from mother to daughter through careful instruction and years of practice. The large upright looms used in Viking households took up significant space and required considerable physical strength to operate, as the weaver had to maintain proper tension on dozens of warp threads while passing the weft thread back and forth hundreds of times to create even a small piece of cloth. A single piece of cloth suitable for making a dress might take weeks or months to complete, depending on its size and complexity. The dyeing process added yet another layer of complexity and difficulty to textile production. Natural dyes had to be gathered from plants, roots, bark, and other materials that were only available at specific seasons, requiring women to collect and store these materials when they were available for use throughout the year. The actual dyeing process was both dangerous and unpredictable, involving boiling caustic substances and toxic chemicals that could cause serious burns or illness if mishandled. Even experienced dyers could never be certain that their efforts would produce the desired colors, and a failed dyeing session could ruin weeks of work in a matter of hours. Food preparation and preservation represented another enormous burden that required constant attention and careful planning throughout the year. Viking families could not simply visit a market when they needed food. Every meal had to be planned and prepared from ingredients that were produced, gathered, hunted, or traded by the family members themselves. Women were responsible for knowing exactly how much food the family would need to survive the winter months when no fresh food was available. And calculating these needs incorrectly could result in starvation before spring arrived. The preservation of meat required skills that were both physically demanding and absolutely critical for survival. When animals were slaughtered, usually in late fall, women had to process enormous quantities of meat quickly before it spoiled, cutting it into appropriate pieces for different preservation methods. Some meat was smoked, a process that required maintaining carefully controlled fires for days or weeks, while constantly monitoring the temperature and smoke levels. Other meat was salted, packed in wooden barrels with layers of salt that had to be obtained through trade or by evaporating seawater, an expensive and time-consuming process. Fish, which formed a major part of the Viking diet, presented its own unique challenges for preservation and preparation. Women had to clean and process large quantities of fish quickly when the men returned from fishing expeditions, often working through the night to prevent spoilage. The traditional method of preserving fish by air drying required careful attention to weather conditions and timing. Too much moisture could cause the fish to rot, while too little could result in fish that was too hard to eat or that spoiled quickly when stored. The preparation of daily meals was complicated by the limited ingredients available and the need to make food palatable while conserving precious resources like salt, spices, and cooking oil. Most Viking meals consisted of some form of porridge or stew made from whatever grains, vegetables, and preserved meats were available. But creating variety and ensuring adequate nutrition required considerable skill and creativity. Women had to know how to combine different ingredients to create balanced meals that would provide enough energy for hard physical labor while making limited food supplies last as long as possible. Bread making, while seemingly simple, was actually a complex process that required careful management of scarce resources and specialized knowledge about fermentation and baking. Grain was precious and had to be ground by hand using heavy stone querns, a physically exhausting process that could take hours to produce enough flour for a single loaf. The grinding had to be done regularly since flour spoiled quickly in the damp climate, but grinding too much at once could result in waste if the flour developed mold before it could be used. Water management presented constant challenges in a society without plumbing or easy access to clean water sources. Women were responsible for ensuring that the household had adequate supplies of clean water for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and other essential activities. This often meant carrying heavy buckets of water over considerable distances, sometimes several times per day, depending on the location of the nearest well or stream. During winter months, water sources might freeze solid, requiring women to melt snow or ice to obtain the water needed for daily activities. Cleaning and maintaining the household required enormous effort in an environment where dirt, smoke, and organic waste accumulated constantly. Viking houses were typically single-room structures with central hearths that filled the air with smoke, creating a perpetual layer of soot and grime on every surface. The floors were usually packed earth covered with rushes or straw that had to be replaced regularly as they became fouled with spilled food, animal waste, and general dirt tracked in from outside. Women were responsible for sweeping, scrubbing, and maintaining these spaces while also managing the household's organic waste in ways that wouldn't attract pests or create health hazards. The care and maintenance of household tools and equipment fell primarily to women, who had to ensure that cooking pots, weaving equipment, dairy implements, and other essential items remained in good working condition. Metal items required regular cleaning and oiling to prevent rust, while wooden implements needed to be cleaned, dried, and occasionally repaired or replaced. The loss or damage of essential tools could create serious hardships for a family, making their proper care a matter of economic necessity rather than simple housekeeping. Childcare responsibilities were woven throughout all other household duties. as women were expected to supervise and care for children while simultaneously managing all other aspects of domestic life. Young children required constant attention to prevent accidents around fires, animals, and dangerous tools, while older children needed instruction in the skills they would need as adults. Women had to teach daughters the complex skills required for household management, while also ensuring that sons learned appropriate gender roles and basic survival skills. The seasonal nature of many household tasks meant that women had to plan and organize their work according to natural cycles that could not be altered or delayed. Spring brought the need for intensive cleaning, preparation of fields for planting, and care of newborn animals. Summer required constant attention to growing crops, preservation of early harvest items, and preparation for winter. Fall was dominated by the massive effort required to process and preserve the year's harvest and prepare the household for winter isolation. Winter brought its own challenges of managing limited resources, maintaining warmth, and keeping the family healthy during months of cold and darkness. The social obligations associated with household management extended far beyond the immediate family, as women were expected to provide hospitality to guests, maintain relationships with neighbors, and participate in community activities that were essential for social cohesion. The arrival of unexpected guests could strain household resources, but refusing hospitality was considered a serious breach of social protocol that could damage a family's reputation and standing in the community. Women had to be prepared to provide food, shelter, and entertainment for visitors while maintaining their regular household duties and ensuring that their own family's needs were met. Managing household servants and slaves added another layer of complexity to women's responsibilities, as they had to supervise workers while also training them in proper techniques and ensuring that work was completed efficiently and correctly. The treatment of slaves was a delicate balance. Too harsh treatment could result in rebellion or escape, while too lenient management could lead to laziness and poor work quality that would ultimately harm the household's productivity and survival. The economic aspects of household management required women to make constant calculations about resource allocation, trade opportunities, and long-term planning. They had to know the value of household products in local markets, understand seasonal price fluctuations, and make decisions about when to sell surplus goods and when to store them for family use. These economic decisions directly affected the family's ability to acquire necessary items that couldn't be produced domestically, such as metal tools, exotic spices, or luxury goods that indicated social status. The psychological burden of household management was enormous, as women bore ultimate responsibility for their family's survival and well-being in an environment where mistakes could have fatal consequences. The constant pressure to make correct decisions about food preservation, resource allocation, and family health created a level of stress that modern people can barely comprehend. Women had to live with the knowledge that their skills and judgment were literally matters of life and death for everyone they cared about. A responsibility that weighed heavily on even the most capable and experienced household manager. As the day finally ended, often 12 to 16 hours after it began, Viking women could only hope that their efforts had been sufficient to keep their families safe, fed, and healthy for another day. Tomorrow would bring the same endless cycle of labor, responsibility, and worry, with no prospect of relief or vacation from the crushing burden of ensuring survival in one of history's most demanding environments. This relentless cycle of domestic labor formed the foundation upon which Viking society was built, yet it remained largely invisible and unacknowledged by the men whose adventures and achievements filled the historical record. The greatest terror that awaited every Viking woman was not the threat of raiders or the hardships of winter. It was the inevitability of childbirth. In a society where a woman's primary value was measured by her ability to produce healthy children, particularly sons, pregnancy represented both the fulfillment of social expectations and a journey into what was quite literally a valley of death. Modern medical understanding makes it difficult to comprehend just how dangerous pregnancy and childbirth were in Viking society, where maternal mortality rates reached levels that would be considered catastrophic by today's standards. From the moment a Viking woman reached sexual maturity, usually around 12 or 13 years of age, her body was no longer her own. Marriage typically followed shortly after the onset of menstruation, and pregnancy was expected to occur immediately. The concept of family planning or spacing births was virtually non-existent. Women were expected to bear children continuously throughout their fertile years, with pregnancies occurring as frequently as biologically possible. A woman who failed to conceive quickly after marriage faced social suspicion, potential divorce, and accusations of being cursed by the gods or practicing harmful magic. The physical demands of pregnancy were exacerbated by the harsh realities of Viking life, where pregnant women were expected to continue performing all their regular duties right up until the moment labor began. There was no such thing as maternity leave or reduced responsibilities during pregnancy. Women continued to carry heavy buckets of water, lift enormous cooking pots, chase after livestock, and perform the back-breaking labor required to keep their households functioning. The physical stress of these activities, combined with inadequate nutrition and the demanding climate of Scandinavia, created conditions that endangered both mother and child throughout the pregnancy. Nutrition during pregnancy was particularly problematic in a society where food scarcity was common, and the best available food was typically reserved for male family members who were considered more essential for family survival. Pregnant women often suffered from severe malnutrition, lacking the protein, vitamins, and minerals necessary for healthy fetal development. The Viking diet, heavily dependent on preserved foods high in salt and low in fresh vegetables, created additional health problems including severe edema, high blood pressure, and complications that modern medicine recognizes as symptoms of preeclampsia and other dangerous pregnancy-related conditions. The lack of medical knowledge about pregnancy and fetal development meant that women had no way to monitor the health of their unborn children or recognize warning signs of serious complications. Symptoms that modern medicine would immediately identify as indicators of dangerous conditions were attributed to supernatural causes, moral failings, or the influence of malevolent spirits. Women suffering from severe morning sickness, unusual swelling, or other pregnancy complications were often blamed for bringing these problems upon themselves through improper behavior or inadequate devotion to household gods. Prenatal care, as modern society understands it, simply did not exist in Viking culture. There were no trained medical professionals specializing in pregnancy and childbirth, no systematic methods for monitoring fetal health, and no understanding of the hygiene practices necessary to prevent infections that could kill both mother and baby. The closest thing to medical supervision came from older women in the community who had survived multiple pregnancies themselves, but their knowledge was based entirely on personal experience and folk traditions that often included practices that were actually harmful to maternal and fetal health. The isolation experienced by pregnant Viking women was both physical and emotional. The scattered nature of Viking settlements meant that many women lived far from extended family or experienced female neighbors who might provide support and assistance during pregnancy. When complications arose, there was often no one available who possessed even basic knowledge about handling difficult pregnancies or emergency situations. Women faced the terrifying prospect of dealing with pregnancy complications entirely alone, with only their own instincts and whatever folk remedies they might have learned from their mothers or grandmothers. Superstitions surrounding pregnancy created additional stress and fear for expectant mothers. Viking culture was filled with beliefs about supernatural influences that could harm unborn children, including curses cast by enemies, evil spirits attracted by pregnant women, and magical practices that could cause miscarriages or birth defects. Women lived in constant fear that something they did, said, or thought might bring supernatural harm to their unborn children. These beliefs led to elaborate rituals and restrictions that further limited pregnant women's mobility and activities while adding psychological stress to an already dangerous situation. The actual process of childbirth was a horrifying ordeal that women faced with the full knowledge that they might not survive the experience. Maternal mortality rates in Viking society were astronomical, with historical evidence suggesting that between 20 and 40% of women died in childbirth or from childbirth-related complications. These statistics meant that every woman knew multiple friends, relatives, or neighbors who had died giving birth, making pregnancy a constant reminder of mortality rather than a joyful anticipation of new life. Labor typically took place in the family's main living space, surrounded by smoke from the central hearth, animals, and other family members going about their daily activities. There was no concept of sterile environments or infection control. The same space where food was prepared, animals were brought during bad weather, and daily life unfolded was where women were expected to give birth. The lack of privacy meant that women labored in full view of children, visitors, and anyone else who happened to be present, adding humiliation and stress to an already traumatic experience. Pain relief during labor was virtually non-existent, limited to whatever herbal remedies might be available and alcohol that was often in short supply. Women were expected to endure hours or even days of excruciating labor pain without complaint, as excessive crying or screaming was considered a sign of weakness that could bring shame upon the family. The psychological trauma of enduring such intense pain without relief, combined with the very real possibility of death, created mental health consequences that lasted long after successful delivery. Complications during childbirth were often fatal in a society without surgical knowledge or emergency medical procedures. Breech presentations, prolonged labor, excessive bleeding, and infections routinely killed both mothers and babies. When labor became obstructed or problems arose, the available interventions were crude and often more dangerous than the original complications. Women with relatives who possessed some medical knowledge might receive assistance, but this help was based on trial and error rather than scientific understanding and often caused more harm than good. The immediate postpartum period was equally dangerous, with many women succumbing to infections, bleeding, or other complications in the days and weeks following delivery. The concept of postpartum care was limited to whatever assistance family members could provide while continuing to manage their own responsibilities. New mothers were expected to resume their household duties almost immediately after giving birth, regardless of their physical condition or recovery needs. The combination of inadequate rest, poor nutrition, unsanitary conditions, and immediate return to physical labor created perfect conditions for the infections and complications that killed many women who had survived the actual delivery. Infant mortality rates were so high that many families experienced the heartbreak of losing multiple children, often within their first year of life. Historical evidence suggests that between 40 and 60% of children died before reaching adulthood, with the highest mortality occurring during the first few months of life. Mothers lived with the constant fear that their newborn children would not survive, creating an emotional distance that was often necessary for psychological survival, but which also deprived children of the close maternal bonding that promotes healthy development. The emotional toll of repeated pregnancy losses was devastating for Viking women, who were often blamed for their children's deaths regardless of the actual causes. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths were frequently attributed to the mother's moral failings, inadequate care, or supernatural punishment for unknown transgressions. Women who lost multiple children faced social ostracism and accusations of being cursed or practicing harmful magic, adding shame and isolation to their grief. Nursing presented its own set of challenges and dangers for Viking mothers. Malnutrition and physical exhaustion often prevented women from producing adequate breast milk, forcing them to supplement with foods that were inappropriate for infant nutrition and often contaminated with bacteria that caused fatal illnesses. The lack of safe alternatives to breast milk meant that mothers who couldn't nurse their children had few options for keeping them alive, and many infants died from malnutrition or diseases contracted from contaminated food sources. The social pressure to produce male children created additional stress for pregnant women and new mothers. Sons were considered more valuable than daughters for inheritance, military service, and family security, meaning that women who gave birth to daughters faced disappointment and sometimes anger from their husbands and in-laws. Multiple births of daughters without sons could lead to accusations of inadequacy or divine displeasure, placing enormous psychological pressure on women who had no control over the sex of their children. Child spacing was determined entirely by biology rather than family planning, as Viking society had no reliable methods of birth control. Women faced the exhausting cycle of continuous pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing that wore down their bodies and made each subsequent pregnancy more dangerous than the last. The physical demands of caring for multiple young children while being pregnant again created health hazards for both mothers and their existing children, as exhausted and malnourished women struggled to provide adequate care for growing families. The care of young children presented constant challenges in an environment filled with deadly hazards. Viking households contained open fires, sharp tools, dangerous animals, and numerous other threats that could injure or kill curious toddlers. Mothers had to maintain constant vigilance while also managing their extensive household duties, creating stress and exhaustion that affected their ability to provide safe, nurturing environments for their children. The death of a child due to accidents or preventable injuries added guilt and self-blame to the already overwhelming burden of Viking motherhood. The education and socialization of children required mothers to pass on complex knowledge and skills while also instilling the values and behaviors necessary for survival in Viking society. Daughters needed to learn the intricate skills required for household management, textile production, and food preparation, while sons required training in basic survival skills and understanding of male social roles. This educational responsibility added intellectual and emotional demands to the physical challenges of child rearing, as mothers were held responsible for their children's future success or failure as adults. Discipline and behavioral management of children were complicated by the harsh realities of Viking life, where misbehavior could have serious consequences for family survival and safety. Mothers had to balance the need for strict discipline with emotional nurturing, often in circumstances where their own stress and exhaustion made patient, consistent parenting extremely difficult. The social expectation that children would contribute to household labor from an early age meant that mothers had to train young children to perform dangerous and difficult tasks, while ensuring their safety and emotional well-being. The loss of a husband during pregnancy or while raising young children created catastrophic situations for Viking mothers, who suddenly found themselves without economic support or physical protection. Widowed mothers faced the impossible choice between remarrying quickly to ensure survival and remaining single to maintain some control over their children's upbringing. The social vulnerability of widowed mothers made them targets for exploitation and abuse, while their children often faced reduced inheritance rights and limited opportunities for advancement. Extended family relationships played crucial roles in supporting mothers, but these relationships were often complicated by competing interests and limited resources. Grandmothers, sisters, and other female relatives might provide assistance during childbirth and child rearing, but they also had their own families and responsibilities that limited the help they could offer. The support network that many women relied upon was fragile and could be disrupted by deaths, conflicts, or changes in family circumstances that left mothers isolated during critical periods. The religious and spiritual aspects of motherhood in Viking society created additional pressures and expectations for women who were already struggling with the physical and emotional demands of child rearing. Mothers were expected to protect their children from supernatural threats through proper ritual observances and spiritual practices, while also ensuring that children learned appropriate religious behaviors and beliefs. The failure to properly protect children from spiritual dangers was considered a serious maternal failing that could bring shame and blame upon the entire family. The psychological impact of the constant stress, loss, and responsibility associated with Viking motherhood cannot be overstated. Women lived with the daily knowledge that their children's lives depended entirely on their own skills, knowledge, and endurance, while facing the very real possibility that despite their best efforts, many of their children would not survive to adulthood. This crushing responsibility, combined with the physical demands of continuous pregnancy and child rearing, created mental health challenges that had no recognition or treatment in Viking society. The few women who managed to raise multiple children to adulthood and survive their own childbearing years earned respect and status within their communities. But this success came at enormous personal cost. Their bodies were worn down by repeated pregnancies, their health compromised by years of inadequate nutrition and exhausting labor, and their emotional well-being affected by the losses and traumas they had endured. Even successful mothers faced the reality that their adult children might leave to establish their own households, pursue trading opportunities, or participate in raids that could result in their deaths, meaning that the rewards for surviving motherhood were often temporary and uncertain. The silence surrounding women's experiences of pregnancy, childbirth, and motherhood in Viking historical records reflects the society's general disregard for women's perspectives and the assumption that these experiences were simply natural aspects of female existence that required no special attention or documentation. The voices of Viking mothers, their fears, hopes, and struggles remain largely lost to history, recoverable only through careful analysis of archaeological evidence and the few scattered references in legal documents and sagas that hint at the enormous challenges these women faced in their daily lives. When modern people think of winter challenges, they might imagine dealing with a broken heating system or struggling to clear snow from their driveways. For Viking women, winter was nothing less than a 4 to 6 month battle against death itself, where every decision could mean the difference between family survival and catastrophic loss. The Scandinavian winters of the Viking Age were particularly brutal, marked by what historians now call the medieval warm period's end, and the beginning of cooler climate cycles that brought longer, harsher winters than the region experiences today. The preparation for winter began in late summer and consumed much of a Viking woman's attention throughout the fall months. Unlike modern families who can rely on heated homes, grocery stores, and emergency services, Viking households faced complete isolation for months at a time, cut off from neighbors by impassable snow, frozen waterways, and weather conditions that could kill anyone foolish enough to venture outside unprepared. Women bore the primary responsibility for ensuring that their families had adequate food, fuel, clothing, and medical supplies to survive this isolation, and the consequences of inadequate preparation were literally fatal. Food preservation and storage represented the most critical aspect of winter preparation, requiring women to calculate precisely how much food would be needed to sustain their families through months when no fresh food was available. These calculations had to account not only for immediate family members but also for any servants, slaves, elderly relatives, or guests who might need to be fed during the winter months. The margin for error was virtually non-existent. Too little food meant starvation, while preparing too much meant wasting precious resources that could have been used for other essential needs. The process of preserving enough food for winter survival was staggering in its scope and complexity. Meat from animals slaughtered in late fall had to be processed immediately using techniques that required precise timing and constant attention. Smoking meat properly required maintaining carefully controlled fires for weeks, with women taking turns throughout the day and night to monitor temperature and smoke levels. The failure of a smoking operation could result in the loss of meat that represented months of a family's protein needs, making this process a source of enormous stress and anxiety. Salting meat presented its own challenges, as salt was expensive and sometimes difficult to obtain in sufficient quantities. Women had to layer meat with salt in wooden barrels, ensuring that every piece was properly preserved, while also calculating exactly how much salt to use to prevent spoilage without wasting this precious commodity. The salted meat had to be stored in locations that remained consistently cool and dry throughout the winter, which often meant that women had to check and maintain these storage areas regularly even in the depths of winter storms. Fish preservation was equally demanding and time-sensitive, as the nutritional value of fish made it essential for winter survival. but its tendency to spoil quickly made preservation extremely challenging. Women had to clean and process enormous quantities of fish in the brief window between when the men returned from fishing expeditions and when the fish began to deteriorate. The traditional method of air-drying fish required perfect weather conditions. Too much humidity could cause the fish to rot, while insufficient air circulation could result in incomplete preservation that would fail during winter storage. Dairy products required constant attention throughout the fall months, as women worked to preserve the summer's milk production in forms that would remain edible throughout the winter. Cheese production was a complex process that could easily fail if temperatures, timing, or ingredients were not perfectly managed. A failed batch of cheese represented not only the loss of valuable liver nutrition, but also the waste of milk that could have been used for other preservation methods. Women had to become expert judges of fermentation processes, knowing exactly when to press cheese, how long to age it, and how to store it to prevent spoilage during the long winter months. Grain storage presented another critical challenge, as families needed sufficient grain to last through winter and into the next growing season, when fresh food would again become available. Women had to ensure that grain was completely dry before storage, as any moisture could lead to mold or rot that would destroy months of food supplies. The storage containers had to be protected from rodents, insects, and moisture while remaining accessible for daily food preparation throughout the winter. Regular inspection of grain stores was necessary to catch problems early, but this meant exposing stored food to temperature fluctuations and potential contamination each time storage areas were open. The collection and preservation of vegetables and fruits required extensive knowledge of timing techniques and storage methods that were passed down through generations of women who had learned through trial and error which methods worked and which led to food loss. Root vegetables had to be harvested at exactly the right time and stored in root cellars that maintained proper temperature and humidity levels throughout the winter. Apples and other fruits needed to be carefully sorted, with only perfect specimens stored for winter use, while damaged fruit was processed immediately into preserves or dried goods. Fuel management was equally critical for winter survival, as running out of firewood or other combustible materials could mean death from hypothermia for the entire family. Women were responsible for calculating fuel needs and ensuring that adequate supplies were gathered, processed, and stored before winter weather made collection impossible. This calculation had to account for cooking, heating, and the extended hours of darkness that required artificial lighting throughout the winter months. The collection and preparation of firewood was backbreaking labor that required women to work alongside family members to cut, split, and stack enormous quantities of wood. The wood had to be properly seasoned to burn efficiently, which meant that fuel collection had to begin months before it would be needed. Women had to judge the quality of different types of wood, knowing which burned hottest for cooking, which provided the longest-lasting coals for heating, and which created the least smoke in the poorly ventilated conditions of Viking home. Alternative fuel sources such as peat, dried dung, and agricultural waste had to be collected and prepared when wood was scarce or insufficient for winter needs. The collection of these materials was unpleasant and labor-intensive work that often fell primarily to women and children. Peat cutting required knowledge of which areas provided the best fuel and techniques for cutting and drying peat blocks that would burn efficiently. The preparation of dung for fuel required collection, drying, and storage of animal waste in ways that minimized odor and health hazards, while maximizing fuel value. Clothing and textile preparation for winter represented another enormous challenge that required months of advanced planning and skilled work. Every member of the family needed adequate warm clothing to survive winter temperatures that could drop far below freezing for weeks at a time. Women had to produce or obtain woolen garments, fur items, and leather goods that would provide sufficient insulation while also being durable enough to last through months of continuous wear. The production of winter clothing required mastery of complex textile techniques and access to raw materials that were not always available when needed. Sheep had to be sheared at the right time to provide wool of proper quality for winter garments. And this wool had to be processed, spun and woven into cloth before it could be made into clothing. The dyeing and finishing of cloth for winter garments required additional time and materials, as the dark colors preferred for practical winter clothing required specific dye materials and techniques. Fur preparation and leatherworking were essential skills for producing the warmest and most durable winter clothing. But these processes required knowledge of animal hide preparation that was both complex and dangerous. Women had to know how to properly clean, tan, and prepare animal skins for use in clothing, bedding, and household items. The failure of leather or fur preparation could result in clothing that fell apart during winter use or that provided inadequate protection from cold and moisture. The maintenance and repair of existing clothing and household textiles consumed significant time and energy as women worked to extend the life of valuable fabric items that could not easily be replaced during winter months. Mending, patching, and alterations required skilled needlework and careful management of limited supplies of thread, fabric scraps, and other sewing materials. The loss or damage of essential clothing items during winter could create life-threatening situations for family members who no longer had adequate protection from the cold. Bedding and sleeping arrangements had to be carefully planned to provide adequate warmth during the long, cold nights when temperatures inside Viking homes often dropped to dangerous levels. Women were responsible for ensuring that the family had sufficient blankets, furs, and other bedding materials to prevent hypothermia during sleep. The arrangement of sleeping areas had to balance warmth conservation with safety, as families often slept close to fires that posed constant risks of burns or house fires. Medical preparation for winter was crucial in a society where illness during the winter months could easily prove fatal without access to fresh foods, medical professionals, or outside assistance. Women had to gather, prepare, and store medicinal herbs and other remedies that might be needed to treat illnesses, injuries, and nutritional deficiencies that commonly occurred during winter isolation. The knowledge required for effective herbal medicine was extensive and often meant the difference between life and death for family members who became sick during the winter months. The psychological preparation for winter isolation was perhaps the most challenging aspect of winter survival, as families faced months of confinement in small, dark, smoky spaces, with limited activities and constant stress about survival. Women had to plan activities and entertainments that would help maintain family morale during the darkest months, while also managing their own mental health in conditions that would challenge even the most resilient personality. Once winter arrived, the daily struggle for survival began in earnest. The simple act of maintaining adequate heat required constant attention and careful management of fuel supplies that had to last for months. Women had to balance the need for warmth against the conservation of precious fuel, making difficult decisions about when to allow fires to burn low and when additional fuel was absolutely necessary for survival. Water became a major challenge during winter months, when natural sources froze solid and snow had to be melted to provide water for drinking, cooking, and cleaning. The process of melting snow required additional fuel and time, while also providing water that was often contaminated with smoke, ash, and other pollutants from the indoor fires used for melting. Women had to carefully manage water supplies, rationing this essential resource while ensuring that the family had adequate hydration and that food preparation remained sanitary. Food rationing required mathematical skills and psychological strength, as women calculated daily food allowances that would stretch limited supplies through the entire winter period, while ensuring that family members received adequate nutrition to maintain their health and energy. The temptation to consume food more quickly during the early winter months had to be balanced against the very real possibility that supplies would run out before spring arrived, creating constant stress and difficult decisions about family nutrition. The preparation of daily meals during winter required creativity and skill to create variety and palatability from limited ingredients that were often preserved in ways that significantly altered their taste and texture. Women had to find ways to make monotonous, preserved foods appetizing, while also ensuring that meals provided adequate nutrition from the limited variety of ingredients available during winter months. Cooking during winter presented additional challenges as indoor air quality deteriorated from constant fires and poor ventilation, making food preparation more difficult and less pleasant. The smoke and fumes from cooking fires created respiratory problems for family members who were already stressed by winter conditions, while the confined cooking spaces made food preparation more challenging and dangerous. Waste management became particularly problematic during winter months when organic waste could not be disposed of outside and accumulated inside living spaces, creating health hazards and unpleasant living conditions. Women had to develop systems for managing human waste, food scraps, and other organic materials in ways that minimized health risks and maintained some level of sanitation in confined living spaces. The care of livestock during winter required constant attention and significant portions of the family's food and fuel supplies. Animals had to be sheltered, fed, and kept healthy throughout the winter months, despite limited food supplies and harsh weather conditions. The death of important livestock during winter could create catastrophic economic losses for families who depended on these animals for food, materials, and economic security. Illness and injury during winter months were particularly dangerous because of the isolation from outside help and the limited medical resources available within the household. Women had to serve as family physicians, treating everything from minor injuries to serious illnesses using only the herbal remedies and medical knowledge they had acquired through experience and oral tradition. The death of family members during winter created not only emotional trauma but also practical challenges, as bodies could not be properly buried until spring thaw. The psychological stress of winter isolation affected every member of the family, but placed particular burdens on women who were responsible for maintaining family morale and managing the household resources that determined whether the family would survive until spring. The combination of physical hardship, emotional stress, and social isolation created mental health challenges that could last well beyond the winter months and affect family relationships for years to come. The end of winter brought its own challenges as families emerged from months of isolation to discover what damage had been done to their property, what neighbors had survived the winter, and what resources were available for the coming year. Women had to assess the family's condition, inventory remaining supplies, and begin planning for the next year's survival, while dealing with the physical and emotional exhaustion that resulted from months of winter survival. The successful navigation of a Viking winter required a combination of careful planning, skilled execution, physical endurance, and psychological resilience that tested every aspect of a woman's capabilities. The women who managed to bring their families through these ordeals alive and healthy earned respect and status within their communities. But this success came at enormous personal cost in terms of physical health, emotional well-being, and life expectancy. The winter survival skills that these women developed represented some of the most sophisticated survival knowledge in human history, refined through generations of women who learned these techniques through necessity and passed them on to daughters who would face the same life or death challenges in their own households. The romanticized image of Viking society often portrays a world of honorable warriors and strong communities. But for women, daily existence was overshadowed by the constant threat of violence from multiple sources. Violence was not an aberration in Viking society. It was woven into the very fabric of daily life, accepted as natural and necessary for maintaining social order. Women lived in a world where physical abuse, sexual assault, kidnapping, and murder were routine occurrences that could happen at any moment, with little legal protection or social recourse available to victims. The concept of domestic violence as a social problem simply did not exist in Viking culture. where a husband's right to physically discipline his wife was not only accepted, but considered necessary for proper household management. The legal codes that governed Viking society explicitly granted men the authority to use physical force against their wives, with the only restrictions being that the violence should not be so severe as to cause permanent disability or death. These legal protections were minimal and rarely enforced, leaving women vulnerable to abuse that could range from occasional slapping to systematic torture. The isolation of many Viking households made domestic violence particularly dangerous for women who had no neighbors close enough to hear their screams or offer assistance during violent episodes. A woman trapped in an abusive marriage had few options for escape or protection, as leaving her husband meant abandoning any claim to property, children, or social status while facing the very real possibility of starvation or death from exposure. The social stigma attached to divorce meant that even women who could legally escape abusive marriages often chose to endure violence rather than face the shame and practical difficulties of life as a divorced woman. The physical vulnerability of women was exacerbated by the significant size and strength differences between men and women in a society where both sexes performed heavy physical labor that built considerable muscle mass and endurance. Viking men were typically large, strong individuals whose daily activities included weapons training, heavy lifting, and physical competition that prepared them for violence. Women, while certainly strong by modern standards, were still physically outmatched by men who had been trained from childhood to view violence as a normal and acceptable means of resolving conflicts. The weapons that were ubiquitous in Viking households created additional dangers for women who lived in close quarters with men who had easy access to deadly implements. Knives, axes, spears, and swords were essential tools for daily life and were kept readily available throughout the house for work and protection. During domestic disputes, these weapons could quickly transform verbal arguments into life-threatening situations, as angry men could grab deadly implements that were never more than arm's reach away. The legal system that governed domestic relations was heavily biased in favor of male authority and provided minimal protection for women who experienced abuse. While women could theoretically seek divorce on grounds of physical abuse, the burden of proof was enormous and required them to demonstrate their cases before assemblies composed entirely of men who might be more sympathetic to the husband's perspective than to the wife's claims. Even when abuse was acknowledged, the legal remedies available were often inadequate to protect women from continued violence or retaliation. Sexual violence was another constant threat that Viking women faced both within their marriages and from other men in their communities. The concept of marital rape did not exist in Viking legal thinking. A husband's sexual access to his wife was considered one of his fundamental rights, regardless of her consent or physical condition. Women were expected to submit to sexual demands regardless of their own desires, health, or circumstances, and resistance could result in additional violence or punishment. The threat of sexual assault from men outside the marriage was ever present in a society where women often had to travel alone or work in isolated areas, away from male protection. The legal penalties for rape were relatively minor compared to other crimes, and the burden of proof was so high that successful prosecutions were extremely rare. Women who were sexually assaulted often faced additional shame and blame from their communities, particularly if they had been alone or in situations that were deemed inappropriate for respectable women. The vulnerability of women during their husbands' absences created particularly dangerous periods when households were left without male protection for weeks or months at a time. Viking men frequently traveled for trading expeditions, raids, or seasonal work that required them to be away from home for extended periods, leaving women and children vulnerable to attacks from neighbors, strangers, or opportunistic criminals who knew that the household lacked male defenders. During these periods of male absence, women had to assume responsibility for household defense, while continuing to manage all their regular domestic duties. The physical demands of protecting property and family members required skills and equipment that women were not typically trained to use effectively. While some women may have learned basic weapons handling, they were generally not prepared for the kind of organized violence that could threaten their households during their husbands' absences. The slave raids that were a common feature of Viking warfare created particularly brutal conditions for women who were captured and forced into slavery. Female slaves known as thralls had no legal rights whatsoever and could be subjected to any form of abuse their masters desired without legal consequences. The capture of women during raids was often accompanied by sexual violence, family separation, and forced relocation to distant areas where they had no social connections or possibility of rescue. The treatment of female slaves was systematically brutal, as they were considered property rather than human beings with any inherent rights or dignity. Slave women could be bought, sold, traded, beaten, sexually assaulted, or killed at their owner's discretion, with no legal recourse or protection available. The constant threat of violence was used to maintain control over slave women and prevent attempts at escape or resistance. The psychological impact of slavery on captured women was devastating, as they were forced to accept that their previous lives, families, and identities had been completely destroyed. Many slave women had witnessed the murder of their husbands, children, or other family members during the raids that resulted in their capture, creating trauma that was compounded by their ongoing abuse and exploitation. The knowledge that they would likely never see their homelands or surviving family members again created a form of psychological torture that accompanied the physical abuse they endured. Free women in Viking society also lived under the constant threat of being captured and enslaved if their communities were attacked or if they were unfortunate enough to be in the wrong place during a raid. The knowledge that capture could result in a fate worse than death created constant anxiety for women who understood that their freedom and safety depended entirely on their community's ability to defend itself against outside attacks. The trading of women as commodities was an accepted practice in Viking society, where female slaves were bought and sold in markets alongside other goods. The slave trade created economic incentives for violence against women, as raiders could profit from capturing women even when other forms of plunder were not available. The commodification of women reduced them to their economic value as workers, sexual objects, or breeding stock, completely eliminating any consideration of their humanity or individual worth. The vulnerability of elderly women was particularly acute in a society that valued physical strength and productivity above other qualities. Elderly women who could no longer perform heavy labor or who required care themselves were often seen as burdens rather than valuable family members. The lack of social safety nets meant that elderly women depended entirely on their families for survival, making them vulnerable to abuse or abandonment if their relatives decided they were too expensive or troublesome to support. Widowed women faced special dangers as they lacked male protection while often possessing property or resources that made them attractive targets for violence or exploitation. The legal system provided minimal protection for widows who could easily become victims of relatives seeking to claim their property or neighbors who saw them as easy targets for theft or abuse. The social isolation of widowhood made these women particularly vulnerable to predators who knew they had little recourse or protection. The interaction between violence and mental health created additional vulnerabilities for women who suffered from what would now be recognized as depression, anxiety, or trauma-related disorders. Viking society had no understanding of mental health issues and often attributed unusual behavior to supernatural causes or moral failings. Women who displayed symptoms of mental illness were sometimes accused of practicing harmful magic or being possessed by evil spirits, making them targets for additional violence or social ostracism. The seasonal patterns of violence in Viking society created predictable periods of increased danger for women. The return of men from raids or trading expeditions often brought increased domestic violence as men readjusted to household life after months of violence and adventure. The consumption of alcohol during seasonal festivals and celebrations also increased the likelihood of violent incidents, as intoxicated men were more likely to assault their wives or other women in their communities. The normalization of violence in Viking society meant that women had few social resources for dealing with abuse or trauma. There were no counselors, social workers, or support groups available to help women cope with violence or develop strategies for protection. The cultural expectation that women should endure suffering silently meant that even discussing abuse was considered inappropriate and could result in additional shame or punishment. The intergenerational transmission of violence created cycles of abuse that affected families for generations. Children who witnessed domestic violence were more likely to accept it as normal behavior, perpetuating patterns of abuse that continued long after the original victims had died. The lack of alternative models for family relationships meant that many people genuinely believed that violence was necessary for proper household management and social order. The economic dependence of women on male family members created additional barriers to escaping violent situations. Women who left abusive husbands faced immediate poverty and homelessness, as they typically had no independent means of support and limited options for employment. The social stigma attached to divorced or separated women made it difficult for them to find new marriages or social acceptance, effectively trapping many women in violent relationships they could not escape. The geographic isolation of many Viking communities meant that women had limited options for seeking help or protection from violence. There were no police, social services, or safe houses where women could find refuge from abusive situations. The scattered nature of Viking settlements meant that even seeking help from neighbors could require dangerous journeys through wilderness areas where women faced additional risks of assault or death. The religious and cultural beliefs that shaped Viking society often reinforced rather than challenged the acceptance of violence against women. The warrior culture that dominated Viking values celebrated aggression and physical dominance, while religious beliefs about gender roles emphasized male authority and female submission. The mythological stories that formed the foundation of Viking culture were filled with examples of violence against women that were presented as natural and acceptable behavior. The legal concept of compensation for injuries created a system where violence against women was treated as property damage rather than personal harm. When women were injured or killed, compensation was paid to their male relatives rather than to the women themselves, reinforcing the idea that women were valuable primarily as property belonging to men. The amounts of compensation required for violence against women were typically lower than those for comparable injuries to men, reflecting their lower status in Viking society. The impact of chronic stress from living under constant threat of violence had severe consequences for women's physical and mental health. The constant vigilance required to avoid or minimize violence created exhaustion and anxiety that affected every aspect of women's lives. The inability to relax or feel safe in their own homes created psychological trauma that was compounded by the social expectation that women should accept their circumstances without complaint. The few women who managed to achieve positions of relative power or influence in Viking society often did so through violence or the threat of violence, using the same brutal methods that were used against them. These exceptional women, who sometimes gained reputations as fierce leaders or warriors, represented rare instances where women successfully adopted male patterns of behavior to gain protection and authority in a violent society. The legacy of violence in Viking society extended far beyond individual victims to affect entire communities and future generations. The normalization of violence against women created social patterns that influenced family structures, economic relationships, and cultural values for centuries after the Viking Age ended. The acceptance of female victimization as natural and inevitable became embedded in social institutions and cultural practices that continued to affect women's lives long after the original Viking society had disappeared. Understanding the pervasive nature of violence against women in Viking society provides crucial context for evaluating the lives and experiences of these historical figures. The constant threat of abuse, assault, and exploitation shaped every aspect of women's behavior, from their daily routines to their long-term life strategies. The remarkable fact is not that some Viking women suffered from violence, but that any women managed to survive and thrive in such a systematically brutal environment. The modern fascination with Viking warrior women or shield maidens as they are popularly known, represents one of the most persistent and misleading myths about Viking society. Television series, movies, and novels have created an image of fierce female warriors fighting alongside men as equals, wielding swords and axes with deadly skill, and commanding respect through their martial prowess. This romantic fantasy, while appealing to contemporary sensibilities about gender equality, bears almost no resemblance to the historical reality of women's roles in Viking warfare and society. The archaeological evidence for female warriors in Viking society is remarkably sparse despite decades of intensive research and excavation at Viking sites throughout Scandinavia and the Viking diaspora. While archaeologists have occasionally discovered graves containing women buried with weapons, these finds are so rare that they represent statistical anomalies rather than evidence of widespread female participation in warfare. The few examples that have been found are often ambiguous, with scholars debating whether the weapons represent actual warrior status, symbolic grave goods, or evidence of women's roles in defending households during emergency. The most famous example of a possible Viking warrior woman is the grave known as B58-1 from Birka, Sweden, which contained the skeleton of a woman buried with a full set of weapons, including a sword, spear, axe, arrows, and gaming pieces that may have indicated military leadership. However, this single grave, dating from the 10th century, represents the only unambiguous archaeological evidence for a high-status female warrior in the entire Viking world. The extraordinary nature of this find actually emphasizes how unusual female warriors were rather than proving that they were common. The literary sources that mention shield maidens are equally problematic as historical evidence. The sagas that describe warrior women were written centuries after the Viking Age ended, often by Christian authors who had political and religious motivations for depicting the pagan past in particular ways. These stories were influenced by literary traditions that emphasize supernatural and extraordinary events rather than realistic portrayals of daily life. The shield maidens described in sagas often display superhuman abilities and engage in battles that are clearly mythological rather than historical. The practical realities of Viking warfare made female participation extremely unlikely for most women. Viking raids and battles required not only physical strength and endurance, but also years of training with weapons and tactics that were primarily taught to men from childhood. The weapons used in Viking combat were heavy and required significant upper body strength to wield effectively. A Viking sword could weigh 3 to 4 pounds and required considerable training to use properly in the chaos of close combat. The logistics of warfare also created barriers to female participation that went beyond simple physical requirements. Viking military expeditions often involved weeks or months of travel under harsh conditions, sleeping outdoors and living on minimal rations. The ships used for raids were designed for crews of 20 to 30 warriors who had to row for hours at a time, while carrying heavy weapons and armor. These expeditions required participants to be in peak physical condition and prepared for the extreme hardships of extended military campaigns. The economic aspects of Viking warfare created additional obstacles to female participation. Weapons and armor were expensive investments that required significant family resources to purchase and maintain. Most families could afford to outfit only 1 or 2 warriors, typically the male household heads who were expected to defend family interests and bring home plunder from successful raids. The idea that families would invest scarce resources in arming women for warfare becomes even more unlikely when considering that women were essential for maintaining households during men's absences. The social structure of Viking society was built around gender-specific roles that made widespread female participation in warfare practically impossible. Women were responsible for managing complex households that included food production, textile manufacture, childcare, and numerous other essential tasks that could not be abandoned for months at a time. The idea that significant numbers of women could leave these responsibilities to participate in raids ignores the economic realities that made their domestic labor essential for family survival. The few historical examples of women participating in Viking warfare appear to have been extraordinary individuals operating under unusual circumstances rather than representatives of common practice. These exceptional women often gained their reputations through defending their homes and families during emergencies rather than through aggressive participation in raids or battles. The distinction between defensive action during crises and regular participation in military expeditions is crucial for understanding the true nature of women's roles in Viking warfare. The mythological aspects of Shield Maiden stories reveal their function as literary devices rather than historical records. Many saga accounts of warrior women include supernatural elements such as communication with gods, magical weapons, or superhuman abilities that clearly identify these stories as fantasy rather than factual accounts. The literary tradition of depicting strong women as warriors served specific narrative purposes in medieval literature, but should not be mistaken for documentary evidence of actual historical practices. The confusion between historical fact and literary fiction has been compounded by modern interpretations that project contemporary values about gender equality onto medieval societies that operated under completely different social and economic systems. The desire to find examples of powerful women in history has led to the overinterpretation of limited evidence and the creation of myths that, while inspiring, obscure the actual experiences of historical women. The reality of women's roles in Viking military affairs was more complex and nuanced than either the complete exclusion suggested by some historians or the widespread participation depicted in popular media. Women did play important roles in the military aspects of Viking society, but these roles were typically supportive rather than combative. They maintained weapons and armor, prepared supplies for expeditions, managed households during men's absences, and sometimes defended their homes when attacked during raids. The defensive role that women played during attacks on their communities was both important and dangerous, but it differed significantly from the aggressive warfare associated with raiding expeditions. When settlements were attacked, women were expected to help defend their homes and families using whatever weapons were available. This defensive fighting was born of necessity rather than choice, and typically involved protecting children and property rather than seeking conquest or plunder. The skills required for effective home defense were different from those needed for offensive warfare, and were more likely to be possessed by women who had practical experience with tools and weapons used in daily life. Axes used for cutting wood could serve as weapons. Knives used in food preparation could be employed defensively, and familiarity with household layouts gave defenders advantages over attackers. However, these emergency defensive actions should not be confused with the trained professional warfare conducted by Viking raiding parties. The economic motivations that drove Viking raids also help explain why women were unlikely to participate in large numbers. Raids were primarily economic enterprises designed to acquire wealth, slaves, and resources that would improve families' economic positions. The physical demands of capturing and controlling prisoners, loading and transporting heavy plunder, and fighting while wearing armor made these expeditions unsuitable for most women, regardless of their courage or determination. The social consequences of female participation in warfare would have been severe in a society that valued women primarily for their reproductive and domestic capabilities. A woman who was injured or killed during a raid represented not only the loss of an individual but also the loss of future children and the domestic labor that was essential for family survival. The risk-to-benefit calculation for female participation in warfare was heavily weighted against women's involvement in military activities. The romanticization of Viking warrior women has also obscured the actual ways that exceptional women achieved power and influence in Viking society. The women who gained historical recognition typically did so through political maneuvering, economic management, religious authority, or family connections rather than through military prowess. These achievements required different skills and operated within different social frameworks than the warrior culture that dominated male advancement. The examples of powerful Viking women who are documented in historical sources reveal strategies for female advancement that worked within rather than against the constraints of their society. Women like Queen Gunhild of Norway, or Odd the Deep-Minded, gained influence through marriage alliances, inheritance, religious authority, and political networking, rather than through military conquest. Their stories demonstrate that Viking society did provide some opportunities for exceptional women to achieve power, but these opportunities operated through different mechanisms than those available to men. The focus on warrior women in popular culture has also diverted attention from the remarkable achievements of ordinary Viking women, who managed to survive and thrive in one of history's most challenging environments. The skills required to manage complex households, preserve food for winter survival, raise children in harsh conditions, and maintain family economic stability were extraordinary by any measure. These accomplishments deserve recognition even though they did not involve swords and shields. The practical skills that Viking women possessed were often more valuable for long-term survival than the combat abilities celebrated in warrior myths. Women's knowledge of food preservation, textile production, herbal medicine, and household management provided the foundation that made Viking expansion and settlement possible. Without these essential skills, the military expeditions that made Vikings famous would have been impossible to sustain. The misunderstanding of women's roles in Viking society has been perpetuated by the tendency to evaluate historical cultures using modern standards and expectations. The assumption that equality and respect required identical roles for men and women ignores the economic and social realities that made specialization necessary for survival in medieval society. Viking women achieved remarkable things within the constraints of their society, but these achievements were different from those of men rather than identical to them. The archaeological evidence that does exist for women's activities reveals a complex picture of female roles that included economic management, religious authority, artistic production, and social networking. Graves containing scales, weights, and other trading implements suggest that some women were involved in commercial activities. Religious artifacts indicate female participation in spiritual practices and possibly priestess roles. Elaborate jewelry and household items demonstrate women's involvement in artistic production and status display. The genetic evidence from Viking Age populations also reveals interesting patterns about women's roles in Viking expansion and settlement. DNA studies suggest that Viking settlements often included local women who married Viking men, indicating that cultural integration was an important aspect of Viking expansion strategies. This evidence suggests that women played crucial roles in establishing and maintaining Viking communities in new territories, even if these roles were not primarily military. The legal codes that govern Viking society provide additional evidence about women's actual roles and status. While these laws did grant women certain rights and protections, they also clearly delineated the boundaries of acceptable female behavior and the consequences for stepping outside prescribed gender roles. The legal framework reveals a society that valued women's contributions but within carefully defined limits that excluded most forms of military activity. The economic records that survive from Viking Age communities show women's involvement in various productive activities, including textile manufacture, food processing, and trade in luxury goods. These economic roles were essential for family prosperity and community stability, but they operated within domestic and local spheres, rather than the international networks of raiding and trading that characterized male economic activity. The medical evidence from Viking Age skeletal remains provides insights into the actual lives of Viking women that contradict romantic notions of warrior equality. Female skeletons show evidence of nutritional deficiencies, repeated pregnancies, and work-related injuries that reflect lives of hard domestic labor rather than military training. The patterns of injury and disease found in female remains are consistent with the demanding domestic roles described in historical sources rather than the combat activities depicted in popular media. The environmental and climatic evidence from the Viking Age also helps explain why military roles for women would have been impractical. The harsh Scandinavian climate and the subsistence nature of most Viking communities required intensive domestic labor that could not be interrupted for military expeditions. The survival of families and communities depended on women's continuous attention to food production, preservation, and household management rather than periodic involvement in warfare. The comparative evidence from other medieval societies suggests that the Viking pattern of male-dominated warfare was typical rather than exceptional for its time period. While some cultures did include larger roles for women in military affairs, these were usually associated with specific religious or political circumstances, rather than general social equality. The Viking emphasis on raiding and conquest was particularly suited to male participation and less compatible with female involvement than other forms of military organization. The transformation of shield maiden myths in modern popular culture reveals more about contemporary desires for gender equality than about historical Viking society. The popularity of warrior women in television, film, and literature reflects modern audiences' preference for stories that conform to current values rather than historical accuracy. While these stories may be entertaining and inspiring, they should not be mistaken for faithful representations of medieval reality. The real legacy of Viking women lies not in mythical warrior exploits, but in their remarkable ability to survive and contribute to their society within the constraints and opportunities available to them. Their skills, knowledge, and resilience provided the foundation that made Viking civilization possible, even if their contributions were different from those celebrated in warrior culture. Understanding the actual lives of Viking women requires looking beyond romantic fantasies to appreciate the genuine achievements of women who lived in one of history's most challenging environments. The stark reality of life expectancy for Viking women reveals perhaps the most sobering truth about their existence. Most would not live to see their 40th birthday, while modern women can expect to live well into their 80s. Viking women faced a world where death was a constant companion, lurking in childbirth, disease, violence, and the thousand daily hazards of medieval life. The archaeological evidence from Viking Age cemeteries paints a grim picture of lives cut tragically short, with skeletal remains telling stories of hardship, suffering, and premature death that contradicts any romantic notions about the glamour of Viking life. The primary causes of death for Viking women were directly related to their biological functions and social roles. Childbirth claimed more women than any other single cause, with maternal mortality rates reaching levels that would be considered catastrophic by modern standards. Archaeological analysis of female skeletal remains from Viking Age sites consistently shows evidence of multiple pregnancies, with many women dying during their reproductive years. The pelvic bones of Viking women often show stress fractures and other evidence of difficult births, while the absence of older female skeletons in many cemeteries suggests that few women survived their childbearing years. The nutritional deficiencies that plagued Viking women throughout their lives created cascading health problems that shortened lifespans and reduced quality of life for those who survived to middle age. Skeletal evidence reveals widespread malnutrition, with bone deformities indicating deficiencies in essential vitamins and minerals. Iron deficiency anemia was particularly common among women, whose menstrual cycles and pregnancies depleted their iron stores while their diets provided insufficient replacement. The chronic fatigue and weakness associated with anemia made women more vulnerable to other diseases and reduced their ability to cope with the physical demands of daily life. Infectious diseases were another major killer of Viking women, who lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions that promoted the spread of deadly pathogens. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and various gastrointestinal infections swept through Viking communities with devastating regularity, killing the weak and healthy alike. Women's immune systems were often compromised by malnutrition, pregnancy, and chronic stress, making them particularly vulnerable to infectious diseases that men might survive The lack of effective medical treatments meant that even minor infections could become fatal, while epidemic diseases could wipe out entire families within weeks. The physical demands of Viking women's daily lives created additional health hazards that contributed to early death and disability. The constant heavy lifting required for household management led to spinal injuries and joint problems that became increasingly debilitating with age. The repetitive motions involved in textile production caused arthritis and repetitive stress injuries that made it difficult for women to continue working as they aged. The exposure to smoke from cooking fires damaged respiratory systems, while the lack of adequate nutrition prevented proper healing and recovery from injuries. Violent death was another significant risk for Viking women, though the nature of this violence was different from the battlefield deaths that claimed many men. Domestic violence could escalate to fatal levels, particularly when combined with alcohol consumption during festivals or times of stress. The vulnerability of women during raids and conflicts meant that they were often killed, injured, or traumatized during attacks on their communities. The slave trade created additional dangers for women who might be killed if they resisted capture or proved unprofitable to their captors. The seasonal patterns of death in Viking communities reveal the particular vulnerabilities that women faced during different times of the year. Winter brought increased mortality from respiratory diseases, malnutrition, and complications related to childbirth in cold, unsanitary conditions. Spring could bring flooding and epidemic diseases as communities emerged from winter isolation. Summer increased the risks of food poisoning and heat-related illnesses, while fall brought the dangers associated with food preservation and preparation for winter. The psychological factors that affected women's health and longevity in Viking society are more difficult to document, but were undoubtedly significant. The chronic stress of living under constant threat of violence, famine, and loss created mental health problems that had no recognition or treatment in medieval society. The depression and anxiety that resulted from repeated pregnancy losses, domestic abuse, and social isolation could lead to behaviors that increased mortality risk, such as neglecting self-care or engaging in dangerous activities. The lack of medical knowledge and effective treatments meant that conditions that are easily treatable today were often fatal in Viking society. Diabetes, heart disease, and cancer went undiagnosed and untreated, while surgical procedures were crude and often more dangerous than the conditions they were meant to address. Women suffering from mental illness were often assumed to be possessed by evil spirits or practicing harmful magic, leading to treatments that were more likely to cause harm than provide healing. The evidence from Viking Age graves reveals interesting patterns about how women's deaths were commemorated and what this reveals about their social value. The grave goods buried with women typically reflected their domestic roles rather than their individual achievements, with most female burials containing items related to household management, textile production, and childcare. The few women who were buried with weapons or symbols of authority represent extraordinary exceptions that prove the rule about women's limited opportunities for achieving recognized status. The differential treatment of male and female graves also reveals attitudes about the relative value of men's and women's lives in Viking society. Male graves often contain more valuable goods and show greater variation in burial practices, suggesting that men's individual achievements were more likely to be recognized and commemorated. The standardized nature of most female burials suggests that women were valued primarily for their generic roles as wives and mothers rather than for their personal accomplishments or unique contribution. The practice of human sacrifice associated with some elite Viking burials provides particularly disturbing evidence about the value placed on women's lives. Archaeological evidence from several high-status male burials includes the remains of women who appear to have been killed to accompany the deceased men into the afterlife. These sacrificial victims were likely slaves or concubines whose lives were considered expendable for the spiritual benefit of their masters. The willingness to kill women for ritual purposes reveals the extreme devaluation of female life in Viking culture. The impact of women's early mortality on Viking family structures was profound and far-reaching. The high rate of maternal death meant that many children grew up without mothers, creating additional burdens for surviving family members and reducing the emotional and practical support available for child rearing. The loss of women's domestic skills and knowledge disrupted household functioning and reduced families' ability to cope with the challenges of medieval life. The remarriage patterns that developed in response to high female mortality created complex family dynamics that often disadvantaged women and children from previous marriages. Widowed men typically remarried quickly to ensure continued household management and childcare. But the new wives often faced resentment from stepchildren and had to navigate complicated relationships with the deceased wife's relatives. The children of deceased mothers often found themselves marginalized in these reconstituted families, particularly if their stepmothers had children of their own. The economic consequences of women's early death affected not only their immediate families but also the broader Viking communities that depended on their labor and skills. The loss of experienced women disrupted the intergenerational transmission of knowledge about household management, food preservation, textile production, and other essential skills. Young women who lost their mothers early had to learn these complex skills through trial and error, often with tragic consequences for their own family's survival and prosperity. The religious and spiritual aspects of death in Viking society created additional burdens for women who were often held responsible for ensuring proper funeral rites and maintaining ancestral spirits. The death of family members required complex rituals and observances that fell primarily to women even when they were grieving their own losses. The belief that improper funeral rites could result in supernatural retribution meant that women faced enormous pressure to perform these ceremonies correctly despite their emotional distress and practical challenges. The archaeological evidence for women's burial practices reveals attempts to provide spiritual protection and comfort for the deceased, with grave goods that included religious symbols, protective amulets, and items believed to ease the journey into the afterlife. The inclusion of domestic items such as cooking pots, textile tools, and jewelry suggests beliefs about the continuation of domestic roles in the afterlife, reflecting the centralized importance of these activities in women's earthly lives. The comparative analysis of Viking Age cemeteries across different regions reveals variations in women's mortality patterns that reflect local conditions and cultural practices. Communities with better access to trade routes and agricultural resources show evidence of improved nutrition and lower mortality rates, while isolated settlements display higher rates of malnutrition and disease. These variations demonstrate the impact of environmental and economic factors on women's survival prospects. The dental evidence from Viking Age skeletons provides additional insights into women's health and mortality patterns. The high rates of tooth loss and dental disease found in female remains reflect both nutritional deficiencies and the use of teeth as tools for various domestic activities. The patterns of dental wear suggest that women often used their teeth to process fibers for textile production, crack nuts and bones for food preparation, and perform other tasks that damaged their dental health and could lead to fatal infections. The evidence for trauma and violence in female skeletal remains tells stories of lives marked by physical abuse and dangerous working conditions. Broken bones that healed improperly suggest injuries that received inadequate medical care, while multiple fractures indicate patterns of repeated violence or accidents. The prevalence of spinal injuries and joint problems reflects the physical demands of women's work, while head trauma suggests domestic violence or accidents related to dangerous living conditions. The few women who survived to old age in Viking society faced additional challenges related to their reduced economic value and increased dependence on family support. The archaeological evidence suggests that elderly women often suffered from malnutrition and neglect, with skeletal remains showing evidence of untreated diseases and injuries. The social structures that supported elderly men through their roles as advisors and leaders did not extend to women, who lost status and security as they aged beyond their reproductive and productive years. The impact of infant and child mortality on women's psychological health cannot be underestimated, as mothers faced the heartbreaking reality that many of their children would not survive to adulthood. The evidence from family cemetery plots reveals the devastating frequency of child deaths, with many graves containing the remains of infants and young children who died from disease, malnutrition, or accidents. The emotional toll of these losses, combined with the expectation that women would continue bearing children despite previous losses, created psychological trauma that affected women's mental health and life satisfaction. The legacy that Viking women left behind was largely invisible in the historical record, which focused primarily on male achievements and ignored the essential contributions that women made to their society's survival and development. The skills and knowledge that women developed through generations of adapting to harsh environmental conditions provided the foundation for Viking expansion and settlement, even though these contributions were rarely acknowledged or celebrated in contemporary sources. The genetic legacy of Viking women can be traced through modern populations that carry mitochondrial DNA inherited from maternal lineages, providing evidence of the geographic spread and cultural impact of Viking settlement patterns. This genetic evidence reveals that Viking women played crucial roles in establishing and maintaining communities throughout the Viking diaspora, even though their individual stories were not preserved in written sources. The cultural practices and traditional knowledge that Viking women developed for managing households, preserving food, producing textiles, and maintaining family health influenced European domestic culture for centuries after the Viking Age ended. The techniques and traditions that these women created through necessity and innovation became part of the broader European heritage of domestic arts and household management. The material culture associated with Viking women, including their jewelry, household implements, and textile production tools, provides evidence of their artistic creativity and technical skill. The sophisticated metalwork, intricate textile patterns, and innovative household technologies that women developed demonstrate levels of artistic and technical achievement that contradict stereotypes about medieval women's capabilities and contribution. The archaeological preservation of women's graves and artifacts has allowed modern scholars to reconstruct aspects of Viking women's lives that were ignored by contemporary male chroniclers. This material evidence provides a different perspective on Viking society that emphasizes the essential roles that women played in maintaining the economic and social structures that made Viking culture possible. The study of Viking women's lives and deaths provides important insights into the human costs of medieval life and the remarkable resilience of people who survived in extremely challenging conditions. The women who managed to live full lives and raise successful families in Viking society demonstrated extraordinary courage, skill, and determination that deserves recognition and respect even centuries after their deaths. The modern fascination with Viking culture has led to increased interest in women's experiences and contributions, creating opportunities for scholars to develop more complete and accurate understandings of how Viking society actually functioned. The recognition that women's invisible labor was essential for Viking survival and success has begun to change historical narratives about the period and provide more balanced perspectives on medieval gender relations. The ultimate legacy of Viking women lies not in the mythical warrior figures created by modern popular culture, but in the real achievements of ordinary women who managed to survive, contribute, and sometimes thrive in one of history's most challenging environments. Their stories of courage, endurance, and creativity provide inspiration and insight that transcends the specific historical context of their lives and speaks to universal human experiences of struggle, survival, and resilience in the face of overwhelming challenges. The lives of Viking women remind us that behind every great civilization are countless individuals whose contributions were essential but unrecognized, whose struggles were private but profound, and whose legacies live on in the societies they helped to build even when their individual stories have been forgotten. Understanding their experiences provides not only historical knowledge but also perspective on the human capacity for adaptation, survival, and achievement under the most difficult circumstances imaginable.